Good evening. We have a special guest for you this evening, Dr. Kingsley Moghalu. Dr. Kingsley Chiedu Moghalu recently completed a 5-year tenure as Deputy Governor of the Central Bank of Nigeria in November 2014. As Deputy Governor for Financial Stability, he led the implementation of far-reaching reforms to Nigeria's banking sector after the global financial crisis of 2008. He is currently the founder and CEO of Sogato Strategies, LLC, a global strategy and risk advisory firm in Washington, D.C., and is the author of the acclaimed book, Emerging Africa, How the Global Economy's Last Frontier Can Prosper and Matter, published by Penguin Books. Dr. Moghalu is also a partner in the U.S. international law firm Cook Robotham, LLP, and was recently appointed the Professor of Practice in International Business and Public Policy at Tufts University's Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University in Boston, Massachusetts, from July 1st, 2015. He has previously worked for the United Nations for 17 years in strategic planning, legal affairs, and executive management roles at the UN HQ in New York and in duty stations in Cambodia, Croatia, Tanzania, and in Switzerland, rising to the highest career grade of director. Welcome to the show, Dr. Kingsley Moghalu.
Thank you.
Now let's visit your book, Emerging Africa, How the Global Economy's Last Frontier Can Prosper and Matter. Something you discuss is the need for structural transformation of African economies from what is presently a subsistence, agricultural-based economy towards manufacturing and industrialization. Can you please tell us why Africa needs to move from subsistence agriculture towards manufacturing or industrialization?
The reason is that if you study all the advanced and developed economies in the world, you will find out that what has made those countries wealthy is not their natural resources or the export of raw materials. What has made the countries that are wealthy in the world today wealthy is what we call economic complexity. And that is the manufacture of complex products with value and insight embedded in those products and the export of those products. For one, that is what gives competitive advantage. But a lot of African countries are still operating on the basis of comparative advantage. And that's natural resource thinking or raw materials-based advantage thinking. But that does not create wealth, as we have seen after 50 years of this approach. And so that is why I argue that we need to begin to produce products with value added to them. Even in the agricultural space, we should be producing value-added agricultural exports and not exporting raw materials.
That makes sense, Dr. Moghalu. But what is keeping Africa at this subsistence agriculture stage that we seem to be stuck at?
Well, the first problem is what I think is an insufficient appreciation of the distinction between factor endowment thinking in economics and this whole idea of economic complexity that I've spoken about. It's very easy to do what comes naturally, and that is to try to rely on what you think is your own advantage. It takes a lot of effort, it takes a lot of structural shifts to move to a zone that is not a comfort zone. And it takes a lot of human capital, that is skilled manpower, is necessary to make this shift from factor endowment economic thinking to economic complexity. So we need skills for manufacturing. We need all sorts of skills, and we don't have those skills at the level at which we should have them in Africa.
Okay. Let's stay with agriculture for just a bit longer. We do know that 60% of Nigerians engage in agriculture as a way of earning their livelihoods. And this is, you can say this for much of Africa, 70% of Africans engage in agriculture. So it's no time soon that we'll be moving away from that. Just last week on the show, we did a special on a land grab happening in Gasso in Taraba State, where an American company, Dominion Farms, is taking hold of about 30,000 hectares in Gasso at the expense of about 40,000 people who depend on those lands. Given that, African, or in this case, the Nigerian government in Taraba State is putting out a policy that's allowing this to happen. What kind of rethinking does the Taraba State government or Nigeria government in general needs to undertake to make sure that we can try and boost agricultural output through foreign investment, but not at the expense of the people that live off the land?
That's a very good question, because this is a situation in which many African countries are increasingly finding themselves. And that is in the urge to attract foreign investment. They attract foreign investments that is, basically speaking, exploitative and does not serve the the foundational national interest of African countries. Now, if you want foreign investment in agriculture, or if you want foreign investment allowing foreign investors to take up land, that must be negotiated to make sure that the national interest is protected. That can be done in a number of ways. For example, you must negotiate a situation in which most or a portion of what is farmed from such lands is value added. That is to say, there must be a processing industry in that same vicinity. And that processing industry will supply value-added goods to Nigerians and for export as well. This is very, very important, because a lot of farmland investment by foreign corporations is to take out raw farm products to send back to their countries, where those materials are processed and sold back to African countries as finished products. For example, cocoa and chocolate. So it's very important that these kinds of deals be negotiated, where a farmland investment must be accompanied by value-added processing industries and some other value addition activity, and not just farming and exporting. So I think this is the approach to go. And in many ways, if you do this, then the foreign investor will be able to make a profit, but you are also, in reality, developing our own national economies in the continent. So, negotiations have to be done in such a way that our national interests are protected. Foreign investment for its own sake is not necessarily what drives economic development. What drives economic development is whether or not the necessary factor endowments exist for foreign investment to add value, and that is infrastructure and skills. Those are the two things that must exist, so that the people who are working on these farmlands are working in a more sophisticated manner. For example, we need to massively increase the use of scientific technologies in agriculture that can create more yield for less acreage. So when you do this, combined with the idea that I had put out before of ensuring or requiring that you must set up some sort of manufacturing or processing plant along, with that investment, then I think this will protect our own national interest a bit better.
There is need for a new outlook or a new worldview point for Africa. This is perhaps the central theme in your book, which is Africa needs to engage in a different way in this age of globalization, so that we are not just consuming the fruits of globalization, but we're actually producing something and getting something out of these transactions. Please explain this for our viewers.
Yes, in the book, Emerging Africa, I argue that our quest for development has not been well thought through. You see, development first and foremost begins in the mind. It is a mental infrastructure affair. It is a psychological process or a psychological posture, and it is a philosophical foundation that you must have in terms of how African countries see the world, interpret the world, understand where they're going, how they wish to get there, who they are in the world, and what their value systems will be, and what their strategies and their knowledge systems will be to create a vision for themselves in the future. If you don't have this worldview, then you are likely to be thrown or blown about by every wind of doctrine. And you are likely to misunderstand globalization, in a way that does not advance your own interest, because globalization is driven by technology. And so you've got to understand that globalization is a process that has global intent behind it, the intent to dominate the world. And it is those who position themselves in the value chain of the production of the products of globalization that can benefit from globalization. If you're just a market for the products of globalization, if you're just a market for the ideas of globalization, then globalization is not necessarily contributing to your transformation. You are not actually transforming. You're being dominated, whereas you might actually think you're participating in globalization. This is what I mean. There is need for a worldview of African development. Africa needs to have a very clear understanding of what its place in the world is going to be and precisely how it is going to get there. Do you want to be a dominant actor? Do you want to be a self-sufficient actor? Or do you want to continue to be a playground for the products of globalization? I think that realistically, what African countries like Nigeria and so on should be aspiring to at this point is to be a self-sufficient actor in the context of globalization.
Africa Rising is a popular narrative that has been playing out in the development circles. But you have said that this is more of a myth than reality presently.
Precisely. The argument I make in Emerging Africa, which is a very different type of book from most of the books you will read about Africa Rising in recent years. On what basis do you argue that Africa is rising? Do you argue that Africa is rising simply because of growth rates, GDP growth rates? There are high GDP growth rates, but there is also still a lot of structural poverty in the continent, and unless you have an industrialized manufacturing economy, unless and until you have strong social infrastructure in the like education and good schools and technical institutes and health infrastructure, unless you have skilled manpower, you can't say you're rising. What Africa has now is a moment of opportunity in which the cyclical, the cycles of the commodity chain have created a boom for the African continent in recent years. And the challenge for Africa is to turn that opportunity into what real development means, and not to get carried away by people telling the continent that it is rising, when in fact it is not. Let me give you another example. Look at Africa's population growth. For you to rise, you must make sure that your population growth is not running ahead of your economic productivity. But that's not what we have in Africa. Africa is scheduled or projected to double in its population in the next 20 to 30 years. Now, that could create a big problem if you don't have jobs. If you don't have this growing population of youth very well and efficiently employed in industry and agricultural production, then what you're doing is building up future potential problems. So these are the reasons why I question the Africanized rising narrative. And I think Africans need to put on their thinking cap and to think things through very thoroughly on the basis of a worldview that is very clear, very articulated by the leadership of each African country, and becomes a part of the educational system in African countries, so that people will grow up with this worldview. And this is how economic transformation happens. Because what is development? Development is when you have a large pool of people pulling in the same direction in terms of the productive activity that they're doing. And that is what creates transformation. There must be a direction, and everybody must key into that direction. Right now, there is no clear philosophical understanding in African countries of capitalism. Every African country is embracing the private sector, and that's very good. But what is the role of the state vis-a-vis the private sector? You have a lot of countries in which governments have abdicated their responsibility to the private sector. But what you need to understand is that the private sector goes only to where it will make a profit. It must be directed by the government with incentives to go to where the social needs are as well, so that we can have inclusive growth, so that we can have growth with jobs, and so on.
One more question on this concept of a need for a world viewpoint for Africa. We have about 54 different African countries who place sovereignty above all else, which means these individual countries deal with their own concerns by themselves and like to handle their concerns by themselves. Given that, and given your experience, and you've been thinking about this world viewpoint for Africa for some time now, is there something or a framework that Africans can, you've developed, that Africans can start thinking about in getting towards a world viewpoint for Africa in this age of globalization?
Before I answer that question, I want to demonstrate the point I made earlier. If you look at the Western world, you will find out that the prosperity of the Western world is based on a certain worldview. What is that worldview that guides the Western world? That worldview is based on scientific rationality. It is based on innovation. It is based on the idea of human rights. So when you combine scientific rationality, when you combine a tendency or attaching importance to scientific innovation with the idea of human rights, you can see how the wealth of the Western world was created in the last 300 years, and you can see how the institutions of the Western world have been built. Now, China is also a rising power. It is rising on the basis of a worldview. That worldview is a worldview in which, time and space are looked at in a cyclical manner, in which the society is far more important than the individual, and in which stability trumps everything else. That's a very different worldview from the Western worldview, but it has also created prosperity for China. So the point is that worldviews are subjective in the beginning, but if they are consistently applied, they can create empirical realities on the ground. Now to the question you raised, specifically about how to develop an African worldview. Africa has 54 countries, and you must start this process from the ground up, I believe, because if you start it from the top down, it's not going to work very effectively. So it's bottom up. Each and every African country must develop a worldview that is consistent with its own reality and its own local context. Now, at the continental level in Africa, say, for example, the African Union, of course, we can have an overarching African worldview because there are some things that African countries all have in common. Most African countries have been colonized. Most African countries are not industrial manufacturing economies, and so on. Most African countries rely on raw materials. Most African countries do not have the same level of skilled manpower as the industrialized world. And so these are all things that are common to Africa. So it is also possible at a continental level to have an overarching African worldview. We had it at one time. There was an African worldview of decolonization, how Africa should be free from colonial domination. That worldview was remarkably successfully executed. The challenge before Africa today is that Africa does not have an economic worldview. Africa has not adapted to the changes in the world in which it is now politically free, but still economically not free. And so the challenge is to develop a worldview of economics and a worldview of globalization that can make Africa play competitively in today's world. Now, in the book, I set out very clearly the process through which this should happen. And I think it's a process that should start within each African country. And I have advocated for committees of wise men comprising philosophers, lawyers, and economists, and so on, to come together and draft documents that governments can then use and test those documents with their citizens and begin the process of the manufacturing of consent in a particular worldview that each government wants to develop for itself and its citizens.
Okay, Dr. Moghalu, I'm so sorry, but we are almost out of time. Can you very quickly, let's talk about this issue of corruption, which perhaps more than any other is holding Africa's development back. Nigeria, let's talk about Nigeria particularly. What can we do as citizens of Nigeria or citizens of Africa as a whole? What can we do to start letting our leaders know that we are watching them, we're watching their activities, and we're expecting much more in leadership from them?
Well, I think, there are a number of ways to do that, and one of the ways is through the electoral process. I think citizens have to hold governments to account in the electoral process and vote in a manner that demonstrates their feelings about these types of issues. But also, it's very important to understand that the whole question of corruption is one of the, it's how do I put it? It's an outcome of the absence of a worldview. So the fundamental problem still remains the absence of a worldview, because one of the components of a worldview is a value system that should guide a society. And when a value system is not very clearly defined in a society, and when it is not indoctrinated into the citizens of that society, maybe through the educational system, maybe through the media, and various other ways, then you can have a lot of corruption. Another thing that creates a lot of corruption is the absence of accountability. When you have institutions that work and people can see that, a massive, large-scale corruption cannot go without punishment, then that also helps to eradicate or at least lessen corruption. Let's be very clear. Corruption is a universal problem. It is not a problem that is unique to Nigeria. It's not a problem that is unique to African countries. A lot of the wealth of Africa that has been allegedly stolen has found their way into Western banks in many countries. And those banks are not owned or run by Africans. So there are many participants in corruption. But for our own sake, as a country or as a continent, it is important that we come to grips with the problem of corruption, because it does steal a lot of possibilities that exist for development and transformation, because that's a diversion of resources that should be going into more productive things.
Thank you very much for joining us at SaharaTV studios, Dr. Kingsley Chiedu Moghalu. Thank you very much for your time. Viewers, you can find his book anywhere. It's published by Penguin Books, and it's called Emerging Africa, How the Global Economy's Last Frontier Can Prosper and Matter. Thank you very much for joining Sahara Reporters.